Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I should add to the plug for C2C Journal. There's complimentary copies available at the registration desk, and the theme of it is very relevant to this conference. The headline is Notes from the Political Wilderness, the Harper Legacy and the Future of Canadian Conservatism. So I think you'll find some interesting and relevant reading there. As you can tell from Dave's intro, I've worked both sides of the media politics street. And while there's obviously an adversarial relationship between journalists and politicos, especially conservative ones, it's always seemed to me just as obvious that there's a symbiotic relationship too. That's why I wanted to title this session, Conservatives and the Media Can't Live With Them, Can't Live Without Them. Love is often fleeting, but that's no reason to blow up a relationship. I spent the first part of my career, my journalistic career, at Alberta Report magazine, which in the 1970s and 80s was a real anomaly in Canadian media, an unabashedly conservative publication in a sea of mostly liberal bias. The Report was sometimes dubbed the unofficial house organ of the Reform Party. We wore that label proudly, although as Preston can attest, we were by no means a faithful transcriber of his press releases. I crossed over to the dark side, as they say, in 2006 to write speeches in the Harper PMO. By then, it seemed to me the Canadian media had become much more ecumenical, thanks in large part to the work of Conrad Black and Ken White at Saturday Night, Maclean's, the National Post, and the Old Southern Broadsheets. The Sun newspapers and private talk radio were also friendly to conservatives. So I really didn't understand the universal scorn the Conservative Party had for the media, which was famously expressed by limiting access and berating them in partisan speeches, some of which I wrote without much conviction. Message success was achieved when a key message from a speech or announcement got into a headline or story. But if you were seen having a beer with a friend from the gallery, that was verboten. Having witnessed many so-called bozo eruptions or picayune mistakes blowing up into far bigger stories than they deserved, I understood the need for message discipline. I also got that running against the media was good for fundraising. But I was ever mindful of the risks of antagonizing people who buy their ink by the barrel or engaging in pissing matches with skunks. In an environment where half the media although the strategy worked for the best part of a decade, I think its accumulated effects came home to roost in last year's election. In an environment where half the media was actively despised the Harper government and the other half never bothered to defend it because it had treated them so badly, there was nothing to stop the proliferation of Harper derangement syndrome, which in my view is the single biggest cause of the government's defeat. My view, however, is tainted by my volunteer work for the Conservative candidate in my home riding in Edmonton. He was a newcomer running against a strong NDP incumbent and needed to build his public profile. He was moderate, articulate, smart, careful. He'd never even peed in a client's coffee cup. Yet the war room imposed the same cone of silence on him as they did on most local campaigns. No media, few debates, just shut up and door knock. The strategy was not just an offense to democracy and conservatism, which in my view involves competing in the marketplace of ideas, but it was a failure for both the local and national campaigns. All of that said, I'm mindful of the fact that Donald Trump, and in fact most of the contenders for the Republican presidential nomination, are running as hard against the media as they are against the Democrats. Trump even went after Fox News' Megyn Kelly, which seemed to me a willful attempt to turn a friendly into a hostile. And like every other straw man or woman he attacks, it just drove his support higher. So for all I know, it's still good politics in 2016 for conservatives to demonize the media. But let's turn it over to our panel, who I've asked to focus on three questions. Is the mainstream media universally hostile to conservative governments, parties, and ideas? Is it effective political strategy for conservatives to willfully shut out, antagonize, and run against the mainstream media? And finally, I hope they can offer us some tips to conservatives to cultivate better media relations. Our panel includes Lydia Miljan, an associate professor of political science at the University of Windsor and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. She was director of the Institute's Alberta Policy Research Centre, and from 1988 to 2001 was chair of the National Media Archive. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary, specializing in political communication. Sara McIntyre, whose paths crossed with mine in the PMO, began her career in politics when joining the Opposition Leader's Office in 2002. She's since worked with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and an offshore wind company, and as Prime Minister Stephen Harper's press secretary. She currently runs her own communications consulting company. She has a regular column in the Sun Media chain and appears frequently on CP24 and Toronto CFRB News Talk 1010. John Ibbitson joined the Globe and Mail in 1999 after stints at the Ottawa Citizen and National Post. He's served as the Globe's Queen's Park, Washington, and Ottawa bureau chiefs, and he's currently a writer-at-large for the Globe. He's also written a biography of Stephen Harper, and I might add a very interesting book about the 2011 election called The Big Shift. So I'll turn it over to Lydia to begin.
Thank you, Paul. 20 years ago, I conducted the first, and as far as I know, only survey of Canadian journalists, asking them about their values and beliefs. At the same time, I commissioned a survey of the general public to compare journalists' opinions with everyone else. The results indicated that journalists are not like you and me, and neither are they like the rest of Canadians. Journalists lead public opinion on social issues. For example, they were much more likely at that time to advocate for same-sex rights, for feminism, and for the environment than was the general publication. Now, the results of that study came out in a book by UBC Press called Hidden Agendas, How Journalists Influence the News, and I'm happy to say that there are copies on sale here today at the chapters booth. In terms of voting, journalists were just as enamored by the Liberals as was the rest of the country. So this is a chart from one of the chapters in the book. The darker teal color is, can't even read that from here, as journalists, and the green color are the general population. So in case you were wondering who voted for the NDP in 1996, I'll tell you, it was CBC journalists. And one thing's for certain, journalists were not voting for the Reform Party at that time. On economic issues, they were also to the left of the public. These opinions filtered through to their reporting. After the survey, I did a content analysis of social, economic, and national unity issues and found that the coverage of those issues, not surprisingly, reflected the values of the journalists themselves. The slant of the news was just as the journalist had it, but also the sources that they chose reflected their values rather than that of experts. In other words, the people that they chose to be the authorized knowers, the pundits, the analysts, and the experts, were the people that they happened to agree with. Now, I haven't replicated that study, in part because I don't think journalists' attitudes have changed that much, and in part because, well, quite frankly, there aren't a whole lot of journalists around anymore. Now, I know people at this conference, and those of you who have come to this session, would like me to show you the smoking gun on how the media are biased against small c and large c conservatives. And I certainly have a lot of evidence, especially from those heady days when I ran the National Media Archive at the Fraser Institute and documented on a monthly basis the imbalance of news coverage at CTV and especially at CBC. So the first study showed how the media provided much more critical than favorable coverage towards the free trade agreement. We also found that they ignored debt and deficit issues in the 1990s. They promoted the fiction that there is somehow a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Only the events of the end of the last century dissuaded them of that fantasy. But, you know, when I'm thinking about this, I wonder if it matters anymore. The media industry has changed so fundamentally in the last 20 years that the media's ability to sway public opinion has been seriously undermined. Now, I was never convinced that the media could actually change public opinion. After all, I was paid to record, watch, and analyze CBC News for over 20 years, and they didn't turn me. So people usually tune into CBC because they either like and seek out that point of view, or in the case of conservatives, like Fred Letwin here, we watch it to get our blood boiling. We should also be mindful that there is a tendency to blame the media for one's electoral misfortunes. And this is certainly the case with Michael Ignatieff in the 2000 election campaign when he made this plea in the dying days of the election, where he said, "I'm saying turn the TV off, turn the radio off, put the papers aside, and decide what kind of Canada you want." So I get it. While attacking the media might help you get some money for fundraising, it also makes you look desperate. Where I believe the media do have an influence is in setting the agenda. This, I think, has the greatest impact in moving public opinion. It is the selection of some things and the ignoring of others that is really what impacts public opinion. So let's take a look at the last federal election. The media, and I'll say in particular, CBC's obsession with the Duffy trial was a choice. Well, we can debate the reasons for this. Like, I give you that it was a juicy political scandal. However, and I'll also remind you that they were also gleeful about the Gomery scandal. So a scandal is a scandal. But in terms of the scale of the alleged wrongdoing, it was certainly on the small side. Indeed, living in Ontario, I find it astonishing that the gas plant scandal, while mentioned in passing by the media, has never received as much press as the Duffy trial. Thank you. I got more. The gas plant scandal that cost taxpayers $1 billion is somehow less newsworthy than somebody paying back the government $90,000. To measure the difference, I did a search of transcripts of CBC Power and Politics and CTV Power Play with the news service that my university subscribes to called NewsScan. So let's just look at the cable news channels to give you a sense of the scale of the difference. So this chart's generated by searching the transcripts of Power and Politics and Power Play for stories on the gas plant scandal and the Mike Duffy trial during the last campaign. In all, CBC ran 186 stories on the Duffy trial compared to 3 stories on the gas plant scandal. Similarly, for CTV, they ran 162 stories on Duffy, 1 on the gas plant scandal. Now, NewsScan is a large database of Canadian news. It has all sorts of transcripts and content from newspapers and from websites. So I thought, okay, it could be a problem that these are national broadcasts, and of course they're going to look at national versus local. So let's look at the whole thing. This is all of NewsScan for 2015, and we can see that CBC and CTV were consistent with all the other media. To give you a sense of these numbers, because this just gives you the percentage, there were 7,322 stories on Duffy, yet only 302 stories on the gas plant scandal for all of 2015. So a lot of people are going to say, well, Lydia, you're making too much out of it. There's a big difference between regional and national news. But one thing to remember is that the media aren't always just biased against Conservatives. They're biased in favor of Ontario. So to give you another quick example, I think that we can agree that nothing's more local than municipal politics. So here's a story that was able to capture national attention, the Rob Ford saga. So let's see how Rob Ford measures up in this analysis. Yes, Rob Ford in 2015 got more news coverage than the gas plant scandal on CBC and CTV, but he didn't get as much as Mike Duffy. Here quickly are the numbers for NewsScan for 2015. But if I go back to 2014, you can see that the local can trump the national. For both Power Play and Power and Politics, Rob Ford was more newsworthy than the gas plant scandal or Mike Duffy. In fact, Rob Ford topped the news for all news outlets on NewsScan. So much for this argument that national news doesn't provide as much attention to local matters as it does national matters. This means that the media decide what makes a good news story. Now, certainly, both Rob Ford and Mike Duffy were great stories for the media. They played well in the U.S. media. But think about it. The personal tragedy of Toronto's mayor, who I think didn't fail the people of Toronto as much as he failed himself, was considered by the media infinitely more newsworthy than a provincial government who bought itself some seats and cost the taxpayers over $1 billion, and then proceeded to cover it up. So yes, there's an anti-conservative bias. There is also currently a pro-liberal bias. That's to be expected whenever you have a new government. There's always a honeymoon period for any government, though I suspect that this one's going to last for quite some time, in part because you have a fawning public service who won't be embarrassing the new government anytime soon. But we'll leave that aside for now. So yes, there's bias in the media. There has always been a left-wing bias in the media. This is not news. And my advice, since you asked, for what it's worth is, get over it. Making enemies with the media will not help your cause. Don't give them this easy narrative. The whole limiting access to the media, having only 5 questions, was not only annoying to the media, but it gave them a ridiculous frame to which they could label the government as secretive, controlling, and mean, much like this tweet from a reporter complaining about the lack of access. The time spent on talking about why the Conservatives were muzzling scientists, muzzling the bureaucracy, muzzling cabinet would be better spent talking about the economy, talking about successes, talking about fact-based policy that the government was actually involved with. So while the media's natural inclination is to side with leftist politics, it doesn't mean that they don't try to provide some semblance of balance in their news reports. By avoiding the media, you don't do yourselves any favors. By limiting access, it lets someone else tell your story. Moreover, it doesn't help commentators like myself, who are regularly asked to explain policy and platform of parties. I personally would rather be asked to compare the policies of parties than their media relations strategies. Yet during this election, I was routinely asked to offer some sort of explanation for the way in which the party handled its media relations. So for example, during a campaign stop in Windsor, I ended up in this media scrum with journalists asking that very question. In part, they had to get a comment from a local professor because they couldn't get the Prime Minister to answer any of their questions on his announcement. So my point is that while the natural inclination of journalists is to be critical of the right, they do have occupational norms that require balanced comment. As one of my journalist friends put it, "You give us too much credit. We don't have time to worry about this left and right business. All we want is a good quote." So it is up to you to give them that good quote and stop the war with the media.
Well, I wish I would have read your presentation before I got mine together. There's many similar themes. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a fun vignette. It's adult rated. So for those of you who don't like profanity, maybe you might want to leave the room or perhaps plug your ears. But it's worthwhile. I'm sure. Oh, how do I go back?
Red button.
Red button. Okay. Red button. Is it playing? Here we go. We need some volume.
It's going to be a nightmare. It's bad enough having to cope with the fucking Olympics.
Minister, this is your chance to nail the line. Do you want to nail the line?
No, I'll freestyle.
Wait.
Hello there. Hi.
So is war unforeseeable, Minister?
Look, all sorts of things that are actually very likely are also unforeseeable. For the plane in the fog, the mountain is unforeseeable, but then it is suddenly very real and inevitable. Right.
Is this your opinion, or is this the
Look at the staffers.
The mountain in the metaphor is a completely hypothetical mountain that could represent anything.
So who's the plane and who's the mountain?
What I'm saying is that to walk the road of peace, sometimes we need to be ready to climb the mountain of conflict. Thank you so much.
Climbing the mountain alone at a step.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's it,
Thank you
ladies and
again.
gentlemen.
Thank you. Fuck. Why didn't we nail the line?
Simon, I did try to warn you.
Yes, you tried to warn me, but you didn't actually stop.
All right. That's just for fun. For any of you who have not seen that movie, it's called In the Loop, and if you enjoy politics and communications, it's hilarious. And I wanted to just quickly show this as well. Oh, and do I have to wait for it to play? There we go. Marco Rubio. Here we go. Going to throw a football. Yep. Bam.
A game of cat.
And this one is one of my favorites. It comes from an Instagram poster called The Unemployed Professor. Someone take this loser baby. You can actually hear Trump saying that, can't you? Anyway, so yeah, many of you know I used to be Harper's press secretary, so I'm not really here to be a chief defender of the past 10 years of the media relations strategy from the Harper Conservatives, but perhaps to explain the strategy and provide a little context into the mentality of those that were working in the office at the time. So what was the goal? The goal is always to talk to your voters, and hence you have to use media to do that. That is the tool. Media were seen by conservatives as simply as a tool, although they weren't necessarily seen to be benign. You wanted to get your message to voters with as little editorializing as possible. And so in that regard, the belief that the press gallery had a liberal bias, that they thought that the conservatives were backward, gun-toting bigots that wanted to see women in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant, really lent itself to, we have to figure out a way of getting our message out without it being told by the Ottawa Press Gallery. And I think that that's kind of the refinement of this discussion, is that it wasn't necessarily a war on media per se, it was a war with the Ottawa Press Gallery. And, you know, was it true? Did the gallery have a big anti-conservative agenda to take down the evil Harper conservatives? I don't think so. I worked very professionally with most of them. I think that this is the same group that covered the Martin Chrétien feud, the sponsorship scandal, and I think, you know, frankly, this week the coverage of Justin Trudeau's fiscal update has been pretty savage. So I don't think that they were necessarily had a conspiracy or an agenda to take down the Conservatives. I do believe, however, that many members have been there for a very long time, and just like governments that have been in power for too long, there creeps in a sense of entitlement. Anyway, so let's talk about, if the goal is to get your message to voters, you have to use a medium. You don't want to use the press gallery because they're going to editorialize too much. What are you going to do? Well, it was basically a four-pronged approach here. You got to get out of Ottawa. So if you're going to make an important announcement, get out of Ottawa so you have local reporters actually covering your story as opposed to the press gallery. Secondly, use good visuals. So have a good backdrop, have a good B-roll, have a good podium sign, so that even if you are asked a question on an issue of a day, as opposed to the announcement you're making, you have very good visuals that the media will have to use while they're telling that story. And the third one, which I think is an important one that Conservatives really embarked on first, and I think will be taken up by all political parties, is to reach out to ethnic media. And it always amused me how upset the press gallery got with these roundtables and, you know, as these private meetings the Prime Minister was having, and almost paternalistically suggesting that ethnic media would then, of course, give him positive coverage because of these private meetings. But I think we need to remember as well that very few ethnic media actually have reporters in Ottawa or bureau chiefs. They don't have the facilities to have full editorial board meetings, but they also do have circulation and audience, some of them rivaling some of our very big national daily papers today. And I think that's going to be a strategy that you know, Trudeau will probably take up, and I think future Conservatives would need to do that as well. And then the fourth thing is limit the number of questions. I know this was great anger and frustration, but if your goal is to get your message to your voter and you want to have as little editorializing as possible or to be pulled off your message track, if you limit the number of questions you take from media, then you increase the likelihood that they're going to actually use the clips that you provide, and therefore message success. So that was basically the strategy of the Conservatives. You know, it didn't really change or augment much over the past 6 years. But all of this was frankly This is from Fraser Institute. Lydia will be familiar with this phrase. If it matters, measure it. And measure it we did in the Prime Minister's office. We measured the next day message penetration. What were the visuals? What was the voiceover? What was the B-roll? Where was it placed in the broadcast? What was the headline used? Was there opposition comment in there? And I think it was during this measurement exercise that it helped to reiterate for many around the table that there was, in fact, an anti-conservative agenda with the press gallery. And frankly, it goes on to agenda, as Lydia was mentioning earlier as well. It all comes down to who's setting the agenda. Are you having a media-led agenda where you're being pulled around by your nose by the press gallery and simply responding and flailing and flip-flopping and lacking leadership? Or are you setting the agenda? You're being bold, unwavering, and making decisive actions. So I think that's kind of the nutshell of the strategy. And now I kind of want to go back to a little bit more of the psychology or the mindset of conservatives when it comes to the media. I don't have a ton of time, so I'll try and be quick. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and it was Mike Germano of Vice News speaking, and he talked about leaders and underdogs. Leaders are the top dogs. They're at the top of the food chain. They're the performers. They're the ones everyone needs to beat. And then you have the underdogs. The underdogs, of course, need something to rage against. They need to take on the big corporatist Walmart or Starbucks or McDonald's and provide something organic or some other alternative to consumers that the leaders aren't doing. Leaders use the innovation of underdogs to either buy them out or just do it cheaper. It's a very symbiotic relationship. But then Germano said, and he was speaking, of course, of Vice News, then there are the outsiders. There are those that just don't play by the rules. Actually, they don't give an F-bomb about your rules. They're doing something that they believe is right, perhaps even righteous. And they believe that the establishment and the rules are skewed, that they don't represent their values or beliefs. So I think you're kind of seeing where I'm going to go here a little bit. In 1993, we had the breakdown of the Progressive Conservatives, and we had the emergence of the Reform Party. Reform Party definitely self-identified, I think, as outsiders. They didn't want to play by anyone's rules, and I think the same kind of mentality would apply to Rob Ford and some of the Fordisms, as well as even, perhaps what the strategy that Donald Trump is using. So that's kind of the mentality, is to maintain this operation as an outsider. But even as the party grew and matured and became the Conservative Party and then won minority governments and in fact became a majority government in 2011 with a strong, stable, national, say it with me, Conservative majority government, they still behaved as outsiders. And in fact, instead of using this opportunity in 2011 to rationalize or even normalize relations with media, they in fact did the opposite. They doubled down on it to an almost preposterous and ridiculous and frankly an embarrassing level. There is almost a need to poke the media and the gallery in the eye to show that they actually controlled access and information. So clearly, they were no longer the outsider, but still behaving that way. Of course, 2015 happened, and we are here. So what now? Well, I think we've got 10 years of humble pie to eat with respect to reestablishing a relationship with the Ottawa Press Gallery, but I think you can do it simply by being professional and respectful. Mercedes Stevenson in the journalist panel this morning said basically just be a person, have a phone call, go out and talk to someone and have a coffee with them, get a face to the name. You are now going to be chasing media. They are not going to be chasing you. I remember this in opposition days. We would throw mud constantly at the wall and never get any pickups. So this is the crossroads that we're at. I don't think it's necessarily useful for any vote that you get for a wage of war against the media. You're probably losing a lot in your brand as being divisive. But I'll also leave you with this question. Does it really matter? And this, again, I think goes back to Lydia's point. You look at Facebook, there's something like 300,000 status updates every 60 seconds. There's 2.7 million YouTube videos viewed every 60 seconds on the internet. 500,000 tweets are out. People can get their news from wherever they want. They are now increasingly self-selecting where they get their news. And it's through Facebook feeds and Twitter, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you think about of media and access. But my point is this, it doesn't really matter actually what your relationship with the media is as long as you keep it professional. be a human, be professional, and that will get you a lot farther in the long run than, I think, shutting down access and poking in the eye. If you're going to get a vote that way, that's a vote that's probably going to move very quickly. It's not a very loyal vote. And that's it.
Well, I'm a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, and so it goes without saying that I'm lazy, so I'm going to sit rather than stand at a podium, if you don't mind. And nor do I have any really deep thoughts. I have one piece of advice that I want to give you, because I find that it's a piece of advice that the political types on both the left and the right fail to understand, and if they'd only understand it better, things would work out much better for them. So, but before I get to the piece of advice, look, I believe we talk about the left-wing bias in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. I don't believe there's a left-wing bias in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. I believe there is a Laurentian bias in the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Of course I was going to use this word. Do you think I was going to get through this without using that word? The press gallery, like much of the media, is part of a central Canadian consensus that includes the media, that includes academia, that includes the cultural industries, that includes business, and that for almost 150 years has been debating amongst itself, coming up with solutions and imposing those solutions on the rest of the country, whether the rest of the country liked it or not. That's how the Laurentian consensus works, and the Parliamentary Press Gallery is very much part of that consensus, which was shaken over the course of the last decade by a new Conservative coalition, and which I think ultimately in the long term will be undermined by that coalition. But it's there, so what are you going to do about it? I also believe that people in my craft greatly overestimate the influence that we had on electoral outcomes, including on the last one. We think that quality A is what brings a political party or a political leader to power, and quality B is what undoes that leader. It's not true. As a wise person said, it's actually the quality A that brings you to power, and it's quality A that leads to your defeat. It was the need for message discipline that the Conservative Party imposed upon itself after the 2004 election, so there would be no more bozo eruption, so there would be no more to hell with the Supreme Courts. And it worked, and that message discipline was necessary, and it was effective, and it was successful. But as Sara said, it metastasized in the final years, and the very same quality that made Stephen Harper a successful prime minister was the quality that ultimately led to his defeat. And that's just the way it was. But that said, again, it wasn't the communication strategy of the Conservatives, I believe, personally, that led to their defeat. It was the complete absence of any kind of agenda for another 4 years. There was nothing that you were offering, I say you, assuming you're all Conservatives out there. There was nothing the Conservatives were offering the Canadian electorate in terms of, if elected, we would do this, other than we would continue to do what we did before. The only governing Conservative party in the Western world that had support of immigrant voters, who then went and lost them with barbaric cultural practices and the niqab and the dual citizenship revocation, foolishness like that. And third, I also agree with the line of reasoning that I know runs within some elements of the party, that you never run against the NDP. You only run against the Liberals. And then you went and ran against the NDP. What did you think was going to happen to you? You lost the election. You spent so many years telling the NDP that they should run against the Liberals, and when they finally took your advice, you then ran against the NDP. So you lost the election. And anyway, it was 10 years. It was bound to happen sooner or later. So all of that said, I don't think the gallery, in fact, had that much of an effect on the election, nor does the gallery fully understand how little it does have an ability to influence the agenda, that especially in these days of new media, of the decline of print, that our ability to control the agenda is slipping anyway. Nonetheless, we're going to be around for a few more years. You may have noticed that those publications that have a strong base in the business community are in fact doing quite well. So the Wall Street Journal is doing fine. The Financial Times is doing fine. The Economist is doing fine. And by the way, the Globe and Mail is doing fine. Thank you very much. So we are going to be around. And indeed, if there are fewer and fewer and fewer of us, then the few who are left are going to get more and more and more important. And all that new media that's out there doing all those new media things tend to have a tremendous amount of commentary and very little reporting. What we do is reporting. What we do is actually go out and get information. And I believe that there's always going to be a market clearing price for new and valuable information. And whatever the platform might be, there will be brands that will be able to charge that market clearing price and will profit as they have in the past from doing what they do. So all of that said, what's the one piece of advice that I wanted to give you? Because I found throughout the 10 years that the Conservatives were in power, they consistently failed to take that piece of advice. Oh, by the way, the Liberals, while they were in power, failed to take it largely as well. They weren't as bad about it as you are. And already we are starting to see, those of us who are covering the Liberal government, signs that the Liberals are starting to failing to take the advice. So maybe it's not very good advice, but so here's what that advice is. You have to remember, more than anything else, that journalism is not a profession. It is a craft. There is no college of journalists. There is no license to practice journalism. If you offend the tenets of the profession, you cannot be hauled before the College of Journalists and stripped of your license. There is a constitution that says we can do whatever we damn well please. That's what freedom of expression is. We are just a craft. And while there may be some unspoken rules that some of us follow about what we can and cannot do or should not do, those rules are unwritten and quite often breached. So what do you do then as someone who is trying to work with the media? And Sara may want to violently disagree with me on this. I don't know. We'll find out. The first is understand two things. You can't talk about the media. You can only talk about a gaggle of individual journalists. And your job as a press secretary, a director of communications, or an executive assistant, or whatever it is you are, is to learn each and every single one of those people's weaknesses and strengths and deal with them on the basis of those weaknesses and strengths. This one doesn't have a clue about anything and can't be trusted. This one doesn't have a clue about anything but can be trusted. This one has a clue about these things but no clue at all about these other things and cannot be trusted. This person can be trusted on this and this but not trusted on that and that. This person has absolutely no idea what happens once you get north of North Bay and cannot be trusted on anything about the West but can be trusted on things that have to do with Southwestern Ontario. You just have to build a profile of each and every one of the people that you work with. You need to get to know them very well. We do that, by the way, with you. We get to know the press secretaries and the DCOMs, which ones can be trusted and which ones lie to us. We tend not to talk to the ones that lie to us. So build that profile. And by the way, I know a whole lot about everything. I can always be trusted, and you should always return my call. And there's another reason you should return my call, and the call of everyone who calls you. Once you've built your profile, and once you know who they are, you can shift them. I used to say that when I don't write opinion columns very much anymore. I find that in this new environment, so many people have opinions. Who cares what you think? The only thing that has any real value is what you know that others don't know. So I try to find out things that other people haven't found out about yet, or I try to explain what's going on. Did that with the Conservatives and I'm doing it with the Liberals too. Try to figure out what are they trying to do, how are they doing it, and maybe at the end, think about whether they should have been doing it in the first place or not. But I'd rather explain and provide insight than judge, no matter who that government is. So I used to say that, but when I was writing pure columns, opinion columns, every column started out 100% opinion and 0% fact. That's like, I'm going to write about the wheat board. What do I think about the wheat board? I hate the wheat board. I don't know anything about the wheat board, but my gut reaction is to hate it. Through the course of the writing of the column on the wheat board, I will hopefully acquire facts. And as the facts increase in number, my own particular perspective on the wheat board might A, change, or B, become irrelevant. Because once I have actual facts about the wheat board, I may actually have news about the wheat board. If I have news about the wheat board, then that's far more important than anything I may think about the wheat board. So if you call the reporter back and provide the reporter with information and give the reporter true perspective, and you are doing it in a fair and honest way, very often you will change the reporter's perspective. You will, at the very least, grudgingly compel the reporter to put your side of the argument into the story, if, in fact, that reporter is the kind of reporter who will grudgingly put your side of the story into the story. About the ones who can't be trusted, don't know anything, you know what, nothing you can do about them. But luckily, none of them write for the Globe and Mail. And anyway, they're pretty rare in the Parliamentary Press Gallery overall. It's a pretty professional crew. So that's all I would say. First of all, learn each and every one of them, their strengths, their weaknesses, their foibles, what they like to drink, whether they're morning people or evening people, whether you can trust them on this, whether you cannot trust them on that. And then second, once you know each and every one of the people that you're working with, talk to them. Talk to them all the time, because unless they're completely useless, and there are very few in the gallery who are completely useless, in fact, I think virtually none in the gallery who are very useless, you will be able to influence what it is they're saying and thinking if you talk to them and reason with them. 5, 4, okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your very interesting and thoughtful and entertaining presentations. If you have any, if you have any questions, there's a couple of mics set up and they're live, so you're welcome to step up to them. I think I was going to call for a moment of silence to mourn the demise of print media, but John says we're going to have them around to kick around for a few more years, so that's actually good news in my view.
We won't be print, but we'll be.
Yes. Let's start over here.
All right. Hi, thank you very much for your comments. I have to say I really disagree with the principle behind the leftist media, and I think that when you start labeling things like that, you're excusing yourself of your own foibles or your own actions in that. If you look at what happened in the last election, when the entire post-media chain it came out in support of the Harper government, and as well as the Globe and Mail, you can't really say that we live in a leftist media. So that being said, in the journalism media thing that happened this morning, they talked a lot about having that communication and being passionate about your stance, because it's that passion and that idealism of what conservatism means that's going to bring in more conservatives to you. So if you'd like to talk some more about bridging that gap and getting it out of our heads that it's a leftist media, because blaming and putting the wrong blame on things is not going to get us any closer to winning another election.
Thanks for that. If I might just respond first. My friend Colby Kosh, a very good National Post columnist, in my opinion, has an interesting theory about this sort of the structure of bias in the media. The ground level reporters generally kind of lean left. The columnists, the senior people, are kind of all over the map. And the suits who actually own the media and insist on the editorials, endorsements, are all conservatives. So for what that's worth, anybody comment on her question?
I think the end of Lydia's presentation kind of answers it. So what if they are? Even if they are, it doesn't matter. Get over it. And I think that you should, instead of focusing on a bias that perhaps a medium may have, you should focus on actually having a philosophy that inspires all Canadians. And that, I think, goes back to having this passion. I had a column out yesterday in Maclean's and one in the Toronto Sun, and basically I say I think what's missing in the conservative debates here, what is the introspection, is our unbelievable faith in the individual. That is a very positive, inspiring human principle that I think should be the starting point for any conversation about what is a modern conservative in Canada.
Over here.
Hi, Dennis Burnside. I talked to a lot of people during the campaign when they're challenging our party, and I would say to them what never made a headline was conservatives introduce sensible policy on an important issue, because that doesn't make a headline. And I think the media did have a big impact in this campaign, because I knocked on a lot of doors. I managed the campaign. And what you would do is you would knock on doors and they would say, I don't like that Harper, he does nothing on the environment, he does nothing for Aboriginals, he does nothing on the economy. And you know where they heard that in the media, they didn't hear that from elsewhere. So in the last campaign, and sorry my preamble is going somewhere, but you know, we've done some really good things on fundamental issues in Canada, the labor market, totally reforming the way we transfer billions of dollars of labor market money when everyone knows we have a skills issue. It doesn't get talked about. We had a huge new approach on research that was unprecedented to any other government. It was innovative, it was forward-thinking. It didn't get talked about. What got talked about is Bevo to spend $16 on a glass of orange juice. So I'm trying to square with myself, how do we get our messages out better to people? And we're hearing conflicting messages because we had a journalist panel this morning and they said, talk to us more, you know, give us more scoops and we'll give you fairer coverage, that kind of thing. And then we also hear, we had the slide up there, it's a totally changing landscape. People want short, fast, juicy stories. You know, maybe the media is not the way to go. And the other thing is when you do talk to the media and you do an announcement and you try to get a policy out, they wait for the question at the end where they say, okay, but what about the Duffy trial? You don't answer. And then the headline instead of the policy is Harper dodges another Duffy question. So is our solution to formulate better relationships with the media so that we're getting better stories out there and we're getting our message out there? Or is our solution to go around that, which is what we talk about a lot as conservatives, social media, direct mail, local reporters, direct to people? What's the solution for us if we want to get our message out better?
Sounds like it might be one for John.
Well, look, I don't remember Stephen Harper in the course of the election campaign standing up and making a huge announcement on the environment. I don't recall Stephen Harper in the course of the election campaign standing up and making a huge announcement on Indigenous policy. I do remember Stephen Harper saying over and over and over again the same things. Now, that was a decision, and maybe it was the right decision, maybe it was the wrong decision. It worked in the past, it didn't work this time. Maybe it was just time for a change, and that's all there was to it. But as Mark Cameron said in a column that I have wrote yesterday, there were some, you guys did do some important and good things. You just wouldn't talk about them yourselves, right? You hid your light under a bushel. You got into a rut. All you wanted to talk about was fiscal. I wrote in the Harper biography that your single greatest achievement was that you ended 50 years of warfare between Ottawa and the provinces. But you never really promoted that. Instead, you allowed Wynne to take over the agenda and declare that she was at war with Ottawa. So it was your own messaging that I think you have to take some criticism for, rather than how we were handling it. The only other thing I would say, by the way, do not get it into your head that we are in an era of short, fast, cheap stuff. We've been hearing that for as long as I've been in the business. That there's don't bother with print, it's all television, it's all the 30-second clip, that it's all the 10-second soundbite. That's just stupid. The Globe and Mail has a profound influence on the national agenda, and other newspapers and the CBC do too. But I have a piece that's going in the paper tomorrow that's 4,000 words. We routinely have on our Saturday edition 4,000 and 5,000 word stories on major complex issues. And we know from our own analytics that the reason we do it is they get read. There is an appetite, in fact, for deep and intense discussion of major issues. Not maybe necessarily all the time on everything, but on the stuff that matters. The media, when it's doing its job well, contributes to a national debate and raises important issues that hadn't been discussed before. Don't get sold into the notion that it's all superficial and it's just this soundbite. Over the long term, it's the big 4,000 word story that matters, not the 20-second clip.
Thank you, John. I think we've got time for maybe two more quick
Try to make it
ones.
fast.
Yeah.
My name is David, and I want to come back to the last campaign again, that we saw that some journalists were denied access to some places. You had dogs sniffing into their bags and things like that. And then you got the event with the little Alan Kurdi that died on the beach, and then was reported for about 24 hours that himself and some members of his family were denied entry into Canada, which proved to be not the case. I was wondering, from a party point of view, we pretty much know where some people stand as, okay, the media is good, media is bad, and things like that. But how is the media positioning itself regarding this relationship, whether sometimes there's tendency to be vengeful and to say, okay, this thing happened, we're going to do this thing. But basically my question is, who needs to take the olive branch and say, okay, take your part too? Okay, like you say, you need to talk to the media. I fully 100% agree like this, but communication is a two-way street, but it's a two-way street. There's both sides, both for good and for bad.
Anyone want to take a crack?
Well, I mean, I'll just say that I think the opposition, we obviously need to extend the olive branch. I think there's, as I said, a 10-year chip on the shoulder with the gallery and not necessarily unwarranted. I think that limiting access and not returning phone calls, oftentimes not returning phone calls and simply just sending an email with a email response of a talking point isn't actually relationship building with the media. You actually do have to go and have a beer or a drink or a scotch or something with them. But I think we place too much emphasis on the fact that the media actually, they sit down and they discuss, oh, we're going to get them back at this, that there's like some group mentality there. And there isn't. There's just simply the issues of the day that they need to file on and get answers to. I think, just back to the other gentleman's question about the campaign and whether or not you should try and go around the mainstream media and use social media to get your message out. Absolutely, you should be doing that. I mean, I don't know how many times I heard, and to great anger, that people would say, well, our conservative base, they don't even know what Facebook is or Twitter. And so they would have no resources strategically or effectively aligned towards social media to engage perhaps a whole new generation of supporters. They just wrote them off entirely. And when they did decide to engage with them, they used the same old prepackaged ads that they use for TV. So frustrating. Just had to get that point out.
Thank you.
Clearly.
Last question over here, please.
I wanted to shift the conversation to new media, and in particular, new political partisan media. It seems to be growing more so in the United States than in Canada, but nonetheless, it's happening here too, where on both sides of the aisle, both the left and the right, they look towards media that happen to agree with their point of view. Is that something that's alarming, whether or not you agree if there's a media or Laurentian bias in the traditional media? Is that alarming to see something like, the rebel media on the right side, and on the left, I guess you would probably say Vice? How is that something that's troubling?
For me, it's very troubling. My own diagnosis, for what it's worth, of what's happening in the media is that it's bifurcating in a way that's dangerous for the democracy. It really has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, to be honest with you. But there are always going to be people who know the value of information. If you look at the press gallery in the United States, there are as many reporters now working in Washington as there were in 2005. But they're not working for the major newspapers or broadcasters. They're working for tiny specialty publications. Congressional Quarterly, which will offer, I'm going to invent something here, maritime shipping legislative news with an annual subscription of about $80,000 and a subscriber base of about 150. But those are the corporations that need to know what's happening to maritime legislation. And they're prepared to pay, they're not lobbyists, they are prepared to pay specialty publications to give them that information. There's going to be more and more and more of that. So the really high-end, elite, business-oriented press will survive. The Globe will, and the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. They'll survive because there are people who will pay whatever it is they have to pay to find out whether the rebels are going to take the port. Because if the rebels take the port, cocoa shipments are going to get cut off, and chocolate bar prices are going to go through the roof, and I need to know that as a chocolate bar manufacturer. Whatever it takes to have a reporter at the port monitoring the rebels, they'll pay the price to have the reporter there. And so you will have an elite that will pay, who knows, $500, $600, $700 a year to get the Globe and Mail or to get the Financial Times. And then you will have a massive bunch of people who don't pay that kind of money and who just go to wherever their biases get confirmed. They're to blame, no, they're to blame. And that, for me, is the real danger to the democracy over time.
Well, I'm going to jump in because you guys didn't let me talk. I disagree. I think that that's actually the future of democracy. Whether you like it or not, as being part of the mainstream media is basically your problem, because everybody else has moved away. We're already talking to ourselves. right? We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got Instagram. So yeah, sometimes we'll repost the stories from the mainstream media to criticize, to comment, but sometimes it's nice to welcome a point of view that you agree with, that you don't have to be frustrated with. The problem with those little niche guys is that they are niche. They're not going to have great movements behind them, and there's so many. But in a sense, we're more democratic for them today, given the concentration of ownership and the fact that there are so few news organizations proper, that you need that kind of debate. And I'm excited that people are engaged in debating and, making comments. I mean, I know at least for my own Facebook group, I have people on all different sides of the political spectrum, and sometimes I want to unfriend them because I find their views intolerant or totally crazy, but I don't, because I think it's interesting to see what people are doing. And I mean, there's someone here in the front who's a former student of mine, right? He's a journalist, and I see his stuff all the time, and I'm sure he cringes at my stuff, but at least we're communicating this way, and it's a very public form of communication. So I see it as a real positive change to our democracy.